Bob Henderson had spent his life as a cop, navigating the streets of a city divided in more ways than one. Over the years, he'd seen every kind of human struggle and faced his own battles, none greater than losing his wife 5 years ago. Since then, he'd lived in a quiet home that now felt too large, too empty. Retirement loomed on the horizon, but instead of relief, it brought a gnawing sense of incompleteness. No children, no family to carry on his legacy, just memories and silence. He wasn't a man of self-pity, though. Life had hardened him in some ways, but it had never dulled his sense of empathy. That's why the news about the local foster system always hit him hard. The city was overwhelmed with children who had been passed from one unstable home to another, each transition stripping away more of their hope. Black children, especially, were left at the bottom of the priority list, labeled, troubled, or too difficult, before anyone even tried to understand them. Bob had always thought about doing something, but the idea of it seemed too far-fetched. Adopting a kid at his age? He was already 60, for God's sake. And how would he handle raising a black child when he couldn't fully understand the struggles they would face? It was easier to bury himself in his work, telling himself he'd done enough for the community. Until he saw the girls. The foster system didn't hide its failures well. 6 girls, aged 5 to 12, had been bounced from home to home. The reports painted a grim picture: neglect, abuse, emotional trauma. They had been labeled, abandoned, and written off. The youngest, Mia, was barely 5, and yet already mistrustful of any adult. There was Sam, the one who lashed out, fighting at school, using her anger as armor. Then there was Tasha, silent and withdrawn, who barely spoke unless forced. Each had a history that would make anyone hesitate. But Bob couldn't look away. Maybe it was his years on the force, seeing how life treated those who had no one to fight for them. Or maybe it was that echo of emptiness inside his own house, a place where laughter and chaos had never been allowed to flourish. He'd seen broken systems chew people up his whole life. He wasn't about to let it happen to these kids, not if he could do something about it. His decision wasn't met with encouragement. His fellow officers chuckled at the thought of him, a 60-year-old white man, taking on 6 black girls with troubled pasts. "You'll be dead in a year," one of them joked. His family wasn't much better. His sister, always practical, told him he was crazy. "Why would you do this to yourself? You don't know anything about raising kids, let alone kids with all that baggage." Bob understood the doubts. Hell, he had them himself. He had no experience in parenting, let alone dealing with 6 girls from completely different backgrounds than his own. But something inside wouldn't let him walk away. They had no one else. They had been failed too many times already. When the papers were signed and the girls were officially his, reality hit hard. It wasn't a hallmark moment, no rush of gratitude from the girls or tears of joy. They stood before him, quiet, unsure, and suspicious. Mia clung to her older sister, Sasha, who shot Bob a look that said, "What are you really here for?" He didn't have any answers that would satisfy them. All he could offer was a home, a bed, and a promise that he wasn't going anywhere. The first few weeks were nothing short of a disaster. The girls weren't used to structure, and Bob wasn't used to kids. Sam tested him at every opportunity, throwing tantrums, challenging his authority. Tasha refused to speak, preferring the corner of her room, staring out the window for hours. The younger ones, especially Mia and Sasha, stuck together, keeping their distance from Bob, unsure if this was just another stop on their journey of rejection. Bob tried his best, but there were nights when he sat alone after they'd all gone to bed, questioning everything. What had he gotten himself into? Could he really make a difference, or was he just prolonging their inevitable disappointment? His doubts were real, gnawing at him in the quiet of his now not-so-empty house. But the tipping point came, not in any dramatic moment, but in something small. It was Mia who cracked first. She had fallen while playing outside, skinning her knee. Instead of running to her sisters, she came to Bob. It was tentative, her little body shaking as she held out her arms, unsure of what to expect. Bob knelt beside her, cleaned the wound, and wrapped a bandage around it. She didn't say a word, but she didn't pull away either. And for the first time, he saw a glimmer of trust. That night, as he stood by the doorway of her room, watching her drift to sleep, Bob felt something shift. Maybe he couldn't fix everything. Maybe he couldn't erase the pain these girls had endured. But he could offer them something different, a chance at stability, at healing. It wouldn't be easy, and he knew the road ahead was filled with more battles. But he had made his decision, and he wasn't going back. He might have started this journey alone, but he was no longer walking it that way. These girls were his now, and for better or worse, he was theirs. The first few months were nothing short of chaos. Bob tried to keep things organized, but the girls weren't having it. Mia clung to Sasha like a shadow, scared to even look Bob in the eye. Sam challenged every rule Bob tried to put in place, her anger palpable in every word she spat out. Tasha stayed withdrawn, a ghost in the house, while the others seemed to oscillate between testing Bob's patience and retreating into their own shells. Every day felt like an uphill battle. Bob hadn't anticipated how deep their mistrust ran. They didn't just rebel against rules, they rejected the very idea that someone could care for them without expecting something in return. They'd been burned too many times, shuffled between homes, told by too many adults that they were too much trouble. So when Bob laid out expectations, simple things, like chores and curfews, he was met with defiance or worse, blank stares. He wasn't sure what frustrated him more, their disobedience, or his own inability to reach them. Sam, especially, seemed determined to push him to the limit. She skipped school, mouthed off, and even ran away once, only to return 2 days later, pretending nothing had happened. When Bob confronted her, she simply shrugged and said, "What do you care? You don't even know us." He knew she was testing him, but it didn't make it easier to handle. Every instinct told him to lay down the law. He was a cop, after all, wasn't he supposed to know how to maintain order? But these girls weren't criminals. They were scared, hurt, and hiding behind layers of anger, mistrust, and trauma. His authority, the badge that had once commanded respect, meant nothing here. The racial tension complicated things further. Bob wasn't naive. He knew adopting 6 black girls would raise eyebrows. But he hadn't expected the level of scrutiny and judgment they'd face as a family. His neighbors, who had always been cordial, now gave him sideways glances. At the grocery store, he overheard whispers. It wasn't long before the girls picked up on it too. They were reminded every day that they didn't quite fit, especially in the mostly white neighborhood and schools Bob had enrolled them in. Mia came home crying one day because some kids had teased her, calling her names she didn't understand but felt deep in her bones. Bob felt powerless to protect them from this, an ugliness he never experienced firsthand but was now watching unfold before his eyes. At work, things weren't much better. Some of the guys on the force made jokes that were thinly veiled insults, questioning his judgment, and even his sanity. "What are you trying to prove, Henderson?" they'd say with a chuckle, as if this was all some grand social experiment. He ignored them, but their words stuck. Still, Bob pressed on. He wasn't going to let these girls fall through the cracks, not if he could help it. He just didn't know how to reach them yet. The breakthrough came, not in a dramatic fashion, but in small, subtle moments. One night, Mia had a nightmare. Bob found her sitting on the edge of her bed, trembling and clutching her blanket. For a second, she looked at him like she wasn't sure if she could trust him, but then, slowly, she let him sit beside her. He didn't say much, just put his arm around her. She didn't pull away. In the morning, she was back to her usual quiet self, but something had shifted. With Sasha, it was homework. Bob had walked past the kitchen table, noticing her struggling with a math problem. She was too proud to ask for help, so he offered anyway. She hesitated but eventually slid the notebook toward him. They worked through it together, and for the first time, Sasha cracked a small smile. These moments were few and far between, but each one felt like a tiny crack in the wall they'd all built around themselves. The hardest one to reach was Sam. Her anger ran deep, and she didn't trust easily. But over time, she started to soften. It wasn't a big moment, Just a conversation one afternoon where she opened up about something. Nothing earth-shattering, just school stuff. But it was the first time she'd talked to him without sarcasm or defiance in her voice. Bob listened. That's all it took, really. He listened without judgment, without trying to fix anything, and for once, Sam let him in, even if just a little. The girls began to see that Bob wasn't going anywhere. He wasn't perfect, and he made mistakes, but he was there, every day, through every tantrum, every slammed door, every tear. Slowly, they started to believe that maybe, just maybe, they could trust him. Bob, in turn, started to learn what it meant to be a father. It wasn't about enforcing rules or keeping the peace. It was about being present. He learned that sometimes, all they needed was someone who wouldn't give up on them. He learned that discipline didn't mean breaking their spirits, but helping them understand boundaries. And more than anything, he learned that love wasn't something that happened all at once. It was built, brick by brick, through patience and consistency. It took time, but the house began to feel like a home. Laughter returned in small doses, and the tension that had once filled the air slowly eased. There were still rough days, and the challenges didn't disappear overnight, but the walls were coming down. Bob knew he wasn't just raising 6 girls, he was building a family. The teenage years were a whole new battlefield. Adolescence, as expected, brought its own set of challenges. The trauma the girls carried didn't just vanish, it shifted and changed shape, manifesting in rebellion, emotional withdrawal, and, at times, outright defiance. Bob was no stranger to tough situations, but watching the girls struggle as they grew into young women often left him feeling helpless. Sam, once the most volatile, became even more rebellious. She skipped school, stayed out late, and hung out with kids Bob knew were trouble. She wasn't just testing boundaries, she was daring him to push back. Every fight felt like a personal challenge, her anger bubbling over. But Bob had learned not to meet fire with fire. He didn't yell or make threats, even when it would have been easier to do so. He just made it clear that no matter how far she tried to push him away, he wasn't going anywhere. Sasha, always the protector of the younger ones, started withdrawing into herself, becoming more distant as the pressures of school and life weighed down on her. She carried the weight of responsibility like a burden, often lashing out at the other girls or retreating into long silences that worried Bob. She refused to talk about what was bothering her, bottling everything up until it inevitably exploded. Bob worried that she was losing herself under all that pressure but didn't know how to reach her without smothering her. Tasha, still the quietest, struggled with depression. Her silence wasn't just a personality trait, it was a coping mechanism. She rarely expressed her emotions, preferring to hide away in her room with books and art supplies. Bob didn't push her to talk, but he made sure she knew he was always available. It was hard to watch her isolate herself, knowing that despite his best efforts, she still felt alone. But he stayed consistent, offering support in the little ways that mattered, like sitting with her quietly or encouraging her love for drawing. Even the younger ones, Mia and the twins, were growing up fast, each with their own struggles. Mia, though still sweet, began to question her identity more as she got older, trying to understand where she fit into a world that saw her differently because of her race. The twins were hitting their own rebellious phase, nothing too drastic but enough to keep Bob constantly on edge. They were no longer the little girls who once clung to each other for safety. They were testing the waters, seeing how far they could stretch the limits. The pressure from the outside world didn't ease up either. Bob's decision to adopt 6 black girls still raised eyebrows, even after all these years. His colleagues at the station had stopped making jokes about it, but the underlying tension never went away. Racialized comments from strangers still found their way to him and the girls, whether in the form of snide remarks or quiet assumptions. Bob, with his years of experience in law enforcement, saw the racial profiling his daughters faced, felt the sting of injustice every time they came home with stories of being watched more closely at stores or pulled over for no reason. He couldn't protect them from that, and it killed him. One evening, after a particularly rough day where Sam had stormed out and Tasha hadn't said a word to anyone, Bob found himself alone in the kitchen, staring at the family photos on the wall. The weight of it all felt crushing. He wondered if he'd taken on too much, if he'd made a mistake thinking he could give these girls the life they deserved. The thought of giving up crossed his mind for the first time in years. But then, as if sensing his doubts, Mia walked in. She sat down at the table, no words, just her presence. She didn't need to say anything. Her trust, after all this time, was enough to remind Bob why he couldn't give up. There were still moments of hope, moments that reminded Bob that all the struggles were worth it. Family dinners, once filled with tension and silence, started to feel more like real meals, with laughter and conversations flowing easily. Sasha, in her quiet way, would help Mia with her homework, while the twins joked around, teasing each other like siblings do. Bob found himself smiling more, enjoying the noise and chaos that had once overwhelmed him. School events became milestones for the family. Sasha's graduation from high school was a moment of pride for Bob, not just because of her academic achievements, but because he could see the woman she was becoming, strong, determined, and ready to face the world. Despite her inner battles, she'd kept pushing forward, and seeing her walk across that stage made every hardship feel worth it. It was the same for the other girls, each in their own way. They weren't perfect, but they were growing, finding their paths. Sam, despite her rebellious streak, started to show an interest in law. Maybe it was Bob's influence, or maybe she just wanted to fight the system that had once let her down. Either way, she started talking about becoming a lawyer, about wanting to help kids like herself who'd been forgotten by society. It wasn't an easy path. Her anger still flared up, and her grades weren't always great, but the fact that she was thinking about the future at all was progress. Tasha, ever the artist, began to show Bob some of her drawings. They were dark, full of emotion, but also beautiful in a way that took Bob's breath away. He didn't always understand them, but he knew they were her way of processing everything she'd been through. He encouraged her quietly, not pushing too hard, but letting her know that whatever she wanted to pursue, he'd support her. Mia had started talking about becoming a doctor. She was always the most nurturing of the girls, and it made sense in a way that she'd want to help others. Bob could see her future unfolding before her, the possibilities endless. As the years passed, the girls grew into themselves, each finding her own path despite the struggles they'd faced. Bob didn't pretend that the road ahead would be easy. There were still plenty of challenges to come. But for the first time, he could see a future where they'd all made it through, stronger together. The seeds he'd planted, the lessons he'd taught them through patience and love, were starting to take root. They were growing, and so was he. 20 years had passed, and time had taken its toll on Bob. His once strong frame had weakened, and his health was in steady decline. Now retired, he lived alone in the same house where he had raised the 6 girls who had once filled it with life and chaos. The walls that had witnessed their laughter, their fights, and their eventual growth now felt emptier with each passing year. The girls had all grown into accomplished women, yet the distance between them and their father had widened over time. Bob had stayed in touch with some of the girls, but others had drifted away, caught up in their busy lives or still holding on to remnants of old resentments. It wasn't that they didn't love him, he knew that, but life had a way of pulling people apart, no matter how strong the bonds once were. He thought about them often, wondering if he'd done enough, if he'd raised them right, or if the struggles they'd faced under his roof had left scars that had yet to fully heal. His eldest daughter, Sasha, had become a powerhouse in the legal world. A fierce and dedicated attorney, she had devoted her career to fighting systemic injustice, particularly in the foster care system. The very system that had once failed her and her sisters had become her battleground. Sasha fought for children who had been forgotten, advocating for reforms that would prevent others from experiencing the neglect and pain she had known too well. She rarely spoke about her own past, preferring to focus on the future, but Bob knew that her drive came from the fire that had been ignited during her years under his roof. Despite her success, Sasha didn't visit as often as she used to. The demands of her career were relentless, and though she always made sure to check in on him, the conversations were often brief and to the point. Bob admired her tenacity, but he missed the closeness they'd once shared. He couldn't help but wonder if she still carried a bit of the distance that had lingered between them during her rebellious years. His second daughter, Tasha, had taken a different path, but one that was no less impactful. She had become a social worker and now ran a non-profit organization dedicated to helping underprivileged children and families. She had named it after Bob, honoring the man who had given her and her sisters a chance at a better life. Tasha had found her calling in helping others, and her work had become her life's mission. She understood better than anyone the importance of giving children the stability and love they needed to thrive, something Bob had done for her, even if it hadn't always been easy. Tasha was one of the few who visited Bob regularly, though she was often distracted by the demands of her work. She'd sit with him, talking about the progress her organization was making, but Bob could sense there was always something else on her mind, a restlessness that never quite left her. He was proud of her, though, and seeing the way she had turned her pain into purpose gave him a sense of peace. The third daughter, Sam, had pursued a career in medicine, and she was determined to make sure that Bob received the best care possible. She had always been the one to challenge him the most growing up, but now, as an accomplished nurse, she took her role as his caregiver seriously. Sam made sure his treatments were handled with precision, using her medical expertise and connections to ensure that his quality of life remained high despite his declining health. Their relationship had always been fraught with tension, but as the years passed, Sam seemed to have softened toward him. She didn't visit often, her job kept her busy, but when she did, it was with a quiet sense of responsibility. Bob knew she was making up for the years of pushing him away, though she never said it outright. In her own way, Sam was showing him the love that she had struggled to express when she was younger. His fourth daughter, Mia, had become a successful business owner. She had always been the quiet one, and in many ways Bob hadn't known what path she would take. But Mia had proven to be resourceful and ambitious, building her own company from the ground up. What Bob didn't know, until much later, was that Mia had been secretly financing the renovation of his old house. She'd kept it a surprise, wanting to give him something back for all the sacrifices he had made over the years. One day, Bob came home to find the house completely transformed, a modern sanctuary, with every detail carefully thought out to make his life more comfortable. He had been overwhelmed by the gesture, not just because of the beauty of the house, but because it had shown him how much Mia had cared, even if she hadn't always been vocal about it. The house was her way of giving back, of making sure her father had a safe and comfortable place to live out his remaining years. Then there was Ava, the fifth daughter, who had become a writer. Her memoir had taken the literary world by storm, a raw and moving account of her family's journey through the foster care system and beyond. The book, which she had dedicated to Bob, had raised awareness about the issues facing Black children in foster care, bringing attention to the systemic flaws that had nearly broken her and her sisters. Ava's words had a way of cutting through the noise, revealing the deep truths that so many people tried to ignore. Bob had read the memoir cover to cover, tears in his eyes as he saw their story laid bare. Ava had written about the good and the bad, the struggles they'd all faced, and the love that had held them together despite everything. It was her tribute to him, to the man who had taken a chance on 6 unwanted girls, and it was a reminder to the world of how far they had all come. Finally, there was Zoe, the youngest, who had followed in Bob's footsteps and joined the police force. But Zoe wasn't content to simply be another cop. She had made it her mission to advocate for reform within the department, pushing for changes that would improve relations between law enforcement and the Black community. Zoe understood the complexities of the world she'd grown up in, and she knew firsthand the challenges that came with being both Black and a police officer. She was determined to make a difference, using her position to bridge the gap between two worlds that often seemed at odds. Though Zoe's visits were sporadic, Bob couldn't help but feel immense pride in the path she had chosen. She was continuing his legacy, but in her own way, and that meant more to him than words could express. Each daughter had flourished in her own right, shaped by Bob's influence, though they'd taken different paths. But as they grew in their success, the distance between them and Bob had also grown, a quiet reminder that life doesn't always bring people back together the way we expect. Still, Bob knew that, no matter how far they drifted, the bond they shared would always be there, even if unspoken. Bob sat in his old chair, weaker than he had ever been. His body had betrayed him over the years, but his mind remained sharp. He never imagined his final days would feel so lonely. His daughters had gone on to live their lives, successful, driven women who had overcome the odds. He was proud, of course, but he had come to terms with the idea that he might not see them all together again. Then, one by one, they began to return. First, Sasha walked through the door, still the fierce lawyer she had always been. She had come not just to see her father, but to help him in a way that only she could. A close friend of Bob's was in legal trouble, facing a battle against the same system Sasha had spent years fighting. Without hesitation, she stepped in, determined to ensure justice was served. Her return wasn't just for Bob's sake, it was a repayment of the lessons he taught her, to stand up for what was right, no matter the cost. Not long after, Tasha arrived. True to her calling as a social worker, she had organized a charity event in Bob's name, bringing together community leaders, donors, and activists to raise money for underprivileged children. The event honored his years of sacrifice and his commitment to making a difference, starting with the 6 girls he had taken in. Tasha's quiet yet powerful tribute to her father showed him how deeply his influence had shaped her life's mission. Then Sam, the medical professional, came back. She had been busy ensuring that Bob's long-term care was arranged down to the last detail. Through her connections, she made sure he would receive the best possible treatment, even securing a personal nurse to care for him at home. She wasn't the type to say much, but her actions spoke volumes. Bob saw in her the compassion she had always tried to hide, now fully directed toward making sure he lived his final days with dignity. Mia followed shortly after. Always the quiet one, she said little as she led Bob through the renovated house she had secretly transformed. The home he had known for decades was now a modern, comfortable sanctuary, rebuilt from the ground up with his needs in mind. It was her way of saying thank you for all the years of quiet love and support that she had struggled to express. Bob was stunned by the transformation, realizing just how much thought and effort had gone into making this place his home again. Ava, the writer, came next. She didn't have much to offer in material terms, but she presented Bob with something equally valuable, a copy of her memoir. She handed him the book, the weight of it heavy in his hands. The memoir was more than just their family's story. It was a testament to Bob's influence, a chronicle of how his love and guidance had shaped the lives of 6 women who had once been labeled unwanted. It was her way of showing the world what one man's sacrifice could accomplish, and it was a tribute to the father who had saved them all. Finally, Zoe, the police officer, returned. She had always been the one most like him, strong-willed, determined, and driven by a deep sense of justice. She didn't just come to see Bob. She came to speak at a community event, where she publicly acknowledged the role he had played in her life. In her speech, she spoke about the challenges of being a black woman in law enforcement, the complexities of growing up with a white father, and how Bob's integrity had shaped her career. She called him her role model, a man who had shown her that the world could be a better place if people like him led the way. As each daughter presented their own act of gratitude, Bob was overwhelmed. He hadn't expected this, not the grand gestures, not the visible impact his love had on them and on the world. In his frailty, he had come to believe that his influence might have been fleeting, that the struggles he had endured while raising them might not have been enough. But seeing them now, successful, strong, and determined to make the world better, he realized how wrong he had been. They hadn't just repaid him with care and gifts. They had repaid him by becoming the women he had always hoped they would be, compassionate, courageous, and resilient. His love had transformed their lives, and now, through their work, they were transforming the lives of others. Each one of them had taken the values he had instilled in them and used them to fight for change, to lift others up, and to create a legacy that went far beyond their small family. In those moments, Bob felt an overwhelming sense of peace. He saw clearly that his decision all those years ago, the one everyone had doubted, had been the right one. The struggles, the heartache, and the sacrifices had all been worth it. His daughters were his greatest achievement, and through them, his legacy would live on. As the day drew to a close and the daughters gathered around him, Bob reflected on his life. He had taken in 6 girls the world had given up on, and they had become more than he could have ever imagined. The love he had shown them had come full circle, and in their success he found his own peace. Bob didn't need to say anything. The weight of his emotions, the pride, and the love he felt was enough. He had given them everything he had, and now, they were giving it back to him in ways that he could never have anticipated. His journey was complete, and as he sat surrounded by his daughters, he knew he would never truly be alone again.